Okay, so we're going to do a little review with the concrete process. You are going to have a test Monday on it, so you might want to take notes, whatever you want to do. But make sure you guys understand this stuff. With that, it's the process of finishing, the order in which you do things, maybe tools. You will have some of that same figuring concrete on there, so make sure you understand that. We'll start with, I'm just going to go over the process, but I want you guys to give me the answers. So you're going to pour some concrete. What is the first process? The truck shows up there, you have everything ready, the amount you've already figured, but actually finishing the concrete. So they're dumping the mud, okay? So then what's your first step? What do you have to do?
Smooth it out.
With what? A screed board, exactly. And I meant to grab one, I didn't grab one, but this is your screed board. So you're going from form to form or form to stake, right? And you're screeding that off. What does that process do? Screeding it off.
It smooths it out and brings the cream up and fills in all the holes.
Fills in all the holes, pushes the stone down. Yes. Okay. So everybody understands that. So you got it screeded off. What's your next step? You could edge it next. And that's kind of iffy, that order, as far as edging or cutting joints. Yeah, cutting joints really isn't, but edge, you could edge. But what is the next thing you should do? What tool should you be using here? Okay. If it's a big pour, it would be a bowl float, correct? Right? This would be your first step, right? Okay, bowl float. Can you see that on there, Austin? I can't see if it's on there. Yeah. Okay, so bowl float is first. Okay, so you've bowl floated it. From the video and from my experience, a lot of times you want to bowl float it both directions. We didn't really go over that too much, but whenever possible, you'd want to bowl float it this direction, then right perpendicular to that twice, because it does help. So what does that process do, bowl floating it? Smooths it out more. What else?
Pushes the rocks down.
Rocks down. What comes up?
Cream.
Cream comes up, yes. Okay. So after you would bowl float on something big, what would be your next step?
Wouldn't you edge it then?
You could if you hadn't edged it. And yeah, that's usually the process, bowl float first, because you want to get right on that bowl float while it's pretty wet and get it bowl floated. Then after you edged, what would you do? With what?
Oh, I know the frickin' name.
The thick one, yes. What is this called? There's a few different names that are acceptable. It's not a trowel.
I don't know that.
Hand float, hand derby, mag, they're all acceptable answers. Huh? Okay. So you're going to go over it with this, right? If it was a big pour, you would have to do it on some type of kneeboard. You'd have to get out on it, and you can't just walk on it because it's really wet then, right? And some people's projects was extra wet. So, but you can imagine getting out on that. You got to wait till it gets a certain dryness where you're not making really bad marks with that. So there is sometimes a waiting process before you could get on it, but you would get out there with a hand derby, mag, whatever you want to call it. That would be your next step. Okay, so then your next step would be probably, right, cutting joints where they needed to be.
Then it just keeps smoothing it out when you cut it until it dries. Take it to a point you have to wait for it.
Well, I'm sorry, what? Joiner, yeah. Now, remember I talked about a lot of guys will cut them in the next day with a saw. And it's actually an easier process. But if you were doing it by hand, you would do that. Back to this one. So what is this one doing when you go over it with this?
It smooths it out way more.
Smooths it out. Again, more cream up, stone down, correct? Okay. Hand derby, mag, float, hand float. They're all acceptable answers. So then your next step, after you've went over that process, And we're talking about a broom finish here, by the way. Okay. So what would be your next step?
I just work the cement to harden a little bit.
I'm sorry, what?
Would you let the cement sit?
Yeah, you'd have to let it set, but I mean the next step that you would do once it was ready. A trowel, yes. Remember we talked about, it'd be on knee boards again. You need both of these, this one for leaning. The first time through you would need this for leaning so you could cover it with this. But yes, your trowel would be next, a finish trowel, okay? With that, most of the time for broom finish, all you would have to go over that would be one time with this. And then, depending on how it came out for you, I mean, you'd have to see if there were still lines like grooves where you had swiped it, you'd have to do it again. But most of the time, just one time over. From the video, what did they use in the place of this, though? They didn't get out on it. Does anybody remember the name of that tool? Remember, it hooked to poles just like that, but it wasn't a float.
Is there a peak?
It did. Fresno.
Oh,
A Fresno. Some people use them, some people still like to get out and hand trowel them. So you got that hand troweled, so what would be your final step? Of course you'd want to edge again and get that nice and neat and all that, but what would be your final step?
taking the horn out.
That would probably be the next day, unless you were having to finish the edge, which, like say a driveway, that's what we're working on. You wouldn't finish the edge of a driveway because dirt covers all that up. Remember, it's broom finish. So your last step would be to broom it, right? Remember, they talked about the slowing the process down. He sprinkled it with water. That was probably someplace where it was really hot. It was probably sand underneath. So it was drying quick. So once it got to a certain hardness where the water was not messing the concrete up, he lightly misted it. Like I said, I did driveways where you actually put one of them, just set one of them fan sprinklers out there and let it go slow across it. But slowing that process down makes better concrete, okay? So that's the process of that. So a little bit different if you were smooth finish, say like a garage floor or a basement floor. Process would be the same, okay, other than you wouldn't broom it. You wouldn't want a broom finish, you want a smooth finish. That requires, if you were doing it all by hand, probably 3 times over with this. Okay, so you'd do it, let it harden a little bit more, get out and do it again, but you still would start with this. I mean, you would bull float first, then this about 3 times, okay? And then you wouldn't broom it, of course, because you want smooth finish. There's also power trowels, looks like a big fan. Has handles and you walk it around. That makes the job a lot easier. Most good concrete guys will not rely on that power trowel though. They'll do that for their first 2 times over what you would normally be doing this, and then they'd still get out there by hand the last time and do it by hand. But it does make the process a little bit easier because that machine's doing the work for you 2 times over. All you got to do is walk around. Usually working backwards, and we talked about that, you know, covering your foot tracks, because you are going to make some little marks on it with your feet, but that would clean that right up. Of course, those machines you cannot get up close to the edges. Like if you were pouring inside this room here, like a garage or a pole barn, that machine will not get up close to the edges. So somebody still has to go around and hit them edges by hand on a set of knee boards. So that's the process. Moving to strengthening the concrete up. What things did we have that could strengthen that concrete?
The flex shavings we have, the shavings.
What is that called? You need to know the name of that.
Isn't it just flex?
You're talking about this stuff.
Fiber flex.
Fiber mesh, yes, fiber mesh, okay. You have,
I always forget.
this is wire mesh, okay. And then you also have just what you said, rebar, okay. So I wanted to talk about that. Remember, for your forming, there are wood stakes that you make, right? We got a couple here, different types here, a small one, one a big one. Also using them for grade, as far as out in the center when your street board can't reach, pound them in. But there's also steel stakes for your framework. when you form it up, them work a lot better. They're not splitting up on you and that kind of stuff, and we showed that earlier. So we know the names of the tools. We have some edgers. There are different types. Remember, they had one with a handle. Does anybody remember the name of this tool? Works good to clean your top of your forms off and get a little extra cream to fill some holes and stuff. It's called a margin trowel. Also works good to help clean your tools up. Remember, the process between every thing that you do, you need to wash your tools up. You can't let that concrete harden on there. What else did I want to talk about? So you got your broom on a pole too. Does anybody remember the name of this tool? Helps you get the concrete down right while they're pouring it to get it to height that you want it. Does anybody remember? Come along? Okay, that could possibly be on the test. Something else too, and I know one of the classes I missed this and one I didn't. I'm trying to stretch without pulling that camera over. Did we talk about this? Yeah. It's expansion joint. Usually between, like say you were pouring this room and it was so big you couldn't pour it all in one day, or if you're pouring a driveway and you couldn't pour it all in one day. That's called a cold joint between the concrete you poured before and the concrete you're pouring after. And normally when that happens, you put a piece of expansion along that whole edge where it was the old concrete, and then you pour up to that. Because when it's two separate pieces like that, it's going to move separately. It's not one pour. So if you don't put this in, usually it'll push and it'll crack the concrete one or the other, bust it off, because it can move independently. Where a full slab kind of moves together, especially when you have reinforcement in there. I want to talk about the different types of stone. What are the two different types of stone that can be in concrete?
Limestone, isn't that one?
Limestone and round stone. What is used inside and what is used outside?
Limestone's usually used outside, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And why?
Because it's the most rigid.
It is. It's got all them angles because it's not a perfectly round thing, and that gives that a better place to adhere that concrete. So we have stone in concrete. What else is in concrete?
Water.
Water. What else?
Cement.
I'm sorry?
Cement.
Cement or Portland cement, yes. And then sand. Okay, that's the elements that are in there. Now there are other things like when you pour in the winter, most of the time they'll add chloride to it and it makes it dry really fast, but you need that in the winter because you don't have a lot of working time when it's halfway warm or whatever and you want it to dry. It's bad pouring concrete in the winter because you can have your finish pop off. Usually they'll cover it with some blankets or straw after they finished it to kind of hold that heat in. And that chloride puts more heat into it, so it stays warmer longer than just, you'll pour it with hot water, but that only lasts so long, and then it gets cold, and then a lot of times your finish will pop off. So they put chloride in it so it dries faster, so less chance that you're gonna have your finish pop off. Trying to think if there's anything else that I wanted to cover. I don't think there is. Oh, there is. The process of figuring concrete, cubic yards. Does anybody remember, what's the formula? Thickness, then what else? Divided by 27. That is the formula for figuring cubic yards, right? And that's what you have to figure your concrete in. When you call a concrete company up, you tell them you want 6 1/4 cubic yards or whatever you need, but you have to figure that, okay? So that is the process. Remember, with that, I will not give you full credit if you do not write the formula, show your work. I don't care if you use a calculator, but show your work what you did punched in the calculator, and then at the end it's whatever answer you come up with plus cubic yards of, if it was concrete you would write concrete, okay? If it was sand, I was having you figure write sand, okay? To get full credit for the problem, that's what you have to do. I believe that's all I wanted to cover in the review, so Austin, you can go ahead and shut that off for me.